Hi, I'm Matt, and welcome back to another Toylytics video where we take a look at the analytical side of toy collecting. In this video, we're specifically going to be looking at the Mythic Legions Siege of Bjorngar wave of figures and how those figures sold on the secondary market in the second half of 2023. So this wave is another one of those that I think gets a little bit lost in the shuffle with some of the bigger waves like Erythir, Elithia, the upcoming Poxus wave, but it still has some pretty good figures to take a look at. So let's see which figures were actually a part of this wave. So as you can see here, there's only 5 figures. There were 3 ogre figures and then 2 standard figures. They went on sale for pre-order in December of 2018, and the 2 standard figures were available as Toy-Con New Jersey debut figures in 2019. The rest of them were sent to customers. The pre-orders were sent in late 2019. So these figures have been around for a while. In January of 2024 now. They've been available for over 4 years. Definitely not available regularly at any retailers. So basically, the secondary market is the only place to get them. Makes a lot of sense then to take a look and see what they've been selling for. So let's take a look at the data. And overall, as you might imagine, with only 5 figures, we don't have a whole lot of sales here. But what's interesting is that there's not a lot of spread between these sales, right? So every figure was sold either or somewhere between 12 and 20 times. The Ogre Legion Builder was sold 12 times, and Kurzog was sold 20 times. Everything else was somewhere in between. But still not a whole lot of sales overall. Looking at the sales by month, you can see that in general, these figures were selling somewhere around 1 to 4 copies per month on average. We had 8 Thwicks sold in August for some reason. We had 7 Kurzogs selling in November, and then in December we had a little run of Faustias. There were 5 of them sold there too. So again, not a whole lot sold per month, but it'll be interesting to keep an eye on this sort of data over time to see if there's any sort of seasonality or trends in the number of times these figures are selling. Looking at the average price for the wave, we would expect the Ogre figures to sell for a little bit more because they had an original price that was a little higher than the standard figures. Bolthor the Tower is the highest average price of 133. Kurzog coming up next with an average price of 109. The Ogre Legion Builder average price of 92. So I'm not exactly sure what the retail price was on these ogres. I think it was around $60, maybe $65. So a pretty significant increase compared to the retail price for all of these figures. The Ogre Legion Builder was definitely cheaper. I think he was 40 pre-order and maybe 50 retail because he's a Legion builder. But anyway, regardless, definitely a pretty significant increase here. But then the 2 standard figures also have a significant increase over their $50 retail price as well. Faustia selling for double that, so $100, and Thwick selling for $78. Not too shabby either for something that cost $50 to begin with. Looking at the individual sales for each of these figures, though, get a sense of sort of what happened over the course of these 6 months. We'll look at Bolthor first. As you can see, in general, he didn't sell a whole lot earlier on in the half year. Right? In the summer, there weren't a whole lot of sales, but then we had a lot more sales more recently in late November and into December. A lot of times you see this sort of variability in price when we don't have a lot of sales for a particular item, and that's because people don't really know how to price the figures. If not a lot of them are being sold at the time, you don't really have a lot to go on when you're setting prices, as well as people who are bidding maybe for an auction, they don't really know what a good price or a bad price might be for the figure based on previous sales because there aren't that many to look at. More recently, though, since we've had a lot more sales, we tend to see more clustering in price when we have more sales because people are pricing more to match the market when there is a more established market for that particular item. Doesn't always happen, but we see that pretty often when we have a lot of figures. We see definitely less variability in the price when a lot of one item are being sold at one period of time. So looking more recently at the sales here, you can see that Bolthors were selling anywhere between about 115 to 155. I would say if you see a Bolthor for 110 or definitely below, that's a pretty good price. We haven't seen too many of them over the previous 6 months that were below 110, so that would be a good time to maybe consider picking him up. Although, you may want to hold off and substitute for a half giant Legion builder, which is much cheaper and much more available. But we'll take a look at him in a different wave. Now, looking at Faustia, again, we kind of have a bimodal set of sales here. We had some sales between July and September. She kind of took some time off in October and into mid-November, and then from mid-November into December, she sold reasonably often as well. Looking overall, though, you can see that the prices were relatively steady. There were some loose figures, right? So here's one earlier in the summer sold for 78. Here's one that sold for 82. Here was a new one, pretty good deal, sold for 85. Here was also a more recent one, sold for 85 new. But then we had some other loose figures sold more recently for sub 85. But the other new figures that sold more recently are all above 120. So she's kind of all over the place with respect to prices. She seems to be one where new figures seem to go higher in general than loose figures do. So if you see a loose figure, you may be able to get one for 80 or below, 85 or below maybe. New figures, though, if you see one for, I would say 100 or 110, that seems to be a pretty good deal. Although, some people have been able to get them more recently for less than 100. All right, moving on to Kurzog. Here we seem to have an upward trend, right? So earlier in the summer, he was selling for even some loose figures, right? 62, here's an 85, another 86, 86. Here was a new one selling for 83. But more recently, his prices seem to have increased, right? Not a lot have sold more recently for less than 100. So you can see a new one here sold for 105. Here's one for 108. Here's one for 185, sold December 26th. Seemed to be a pretty significant overpay, but maybe not. There's a 175 as well, sold in November. Here's 135, right? So Kurzog seems to be one where it's going to be harder and harder to get him for less than 100, but we'll see if this pattern starts to level out and maybe come down a little bit when we look at the Q1 data later on. All right, we have the Ogre. This is the Ogre Legion builder. And we had some prices here that are, pretty significant overpays, right? So 187, 143, but looking at everything else, he was pretty much available for less than 100, somewhere between $60 and $100. Some loose ones went for sub 70, but new ones were going between 70 and 100 more recently, and I think that's probably where his price is settled. We know that in the Reinforcements 2 wave, there was the Ogre Legion Builder 2 released with the additional Cyclops head. Those really haven't become available on the mass market because you had to buy a full wave of them when they were available on that one Saturday in November or in October, I believe. Right, so we'll see in February when these become on sale individually and become a lot more available, what happens as far as the Ogre Legion Builder 1, because the Ogre Legion Builder 2 is going to be much more readily available at a cheaper price. I'm going to guess that this price is going to keep coming down to kind of match the price of that Ogre Legion Builder 2. If you're in the market for an Ogre Legion Builder, I would probably wait until at least February to see what happens with hopefully those prices coming down when the version 2 is released on that mass market. And then finally, we'll look at the Goblin Thwick. He's been also a little bit all over the place. We had a lot more sales of him in July through September, not a lot of sales October through December. So you can see here in the summer, right, there were some pretty significant overpays, I think, right, 115, 120. But in general, people were able to get him, especially loose, for sub $60. Even more recently, here's one that sold for below retail loose, $49.50. But the newer figures, here's 79, 95. So it seems like he's one where you should be able to get him for somewhere around $60 to $90. You might want to hold off a little bit if you see them creeping up closer to 100, that price might come down a little bit more because a lot of figures were previously sold lower than $90, and hopefully that price comes down a little bit too. But who's to say, right? Not a lot of them are on the market here in late 2023, so not a lot of sales. So it's hard to tell exactly what's going to happen with that price in the future. If fewer and fewer of them become available, then probably the price is going to keep going up. So if you see a good deal on one for 90 or below, I would say maybe pull the trigger if you're interested in adding him. Otherwise, maybe roll the dice and see if he comes down a little bit as a few more come on the market, especially loose figures. So that is it for the Siege of Bjorngar wave. Again, smaller wave here, but some interesting figures to look at and figures that I think are reasonably popular overall. If you like this video, right, please like, subscribe, share. As everybody else says, I do appreciate it. Please feel free to comment or send me an email if you have any suggestions for other kinds of analysis you'd like to see. I'd be happy to incorporate them into the future videos. And thanks again for watching. I'll see you again in the next one.